In Versailles, even the walls whispered about her. Not as they did about other daughters of the king. Those were proper, composed, brought up like porcelain figurines on a mantelpiece, with a smile, with posture, with empty eyes. Louise was different. She didn't belong to this era. Rather, she anticipated the next. She appeared at the palace in a pink dress that had been sewn hastily. Silk fabric, the color of strawberry sorbet, somewhat inappropriate for her age, and too daring in its neckline. Her mother ordered her to change. She refused. She said, "Isn't that my role? To be seen?" That evening there was a ball. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, candles burned like stars in a golden trap. Ministers, dukes, young officers, all were there. But they weren't looking at each other. They were looking at her. She entered the hall barefoot. Her shoes, embroidered with pearls, remained under a chair in her room. Her feet glided across the parquet like petals. The music hadn't yet begun, but Louise was already moving, either to a rhythm or in anticipation. When the violins began the first part, she danced alone. She chose no one, bowed to no one, only smiled. The dress slipped from her shoulders, not on purpose, but not by accident either. She didn't adjust it. Duc de Conti dropped his glass, Marquis de Brion licked his lips, young Prince d'Albret lowered his gaze, as if afraid of being punished simply for breathing the same air as her, but most importantly, the king. Louis XV stood by a column. His face was motionless. His hand held a glass. His lips didn't tremble. He looked at his daughter longer than was proper. Servants froze. Officers exchanged glances. In this moment, silence became louder than music. Only the creak of parquet under her bare feet reminded she was alive, and no one would stop her. The dance ended. She didn't bow, only walked past her father. Slowly, holding her gaze slightly to the side as if she wasn't afraid but teasing. And he said not a word. The next morning, the servant who had served wine that night was dismissed without explanation. His suitcase was carried beyond the gates before dawn. They said he had spoken aloud. The king's gaze isn't paternal, it's different. The servant disappeared, and Louise remained. But from that day in Versailles, no one looked at her directly anymore, because she was no longer a daughter. She had become temptation, made of pink silk, audacity, and dance, and no one, not even the king, knew which was more in her, the girl, or the mirror reflecting his weakness. Chapter 2. The Girl Who Has No Right to Be Innocent. Her childhood began with prayer and ended with the scent of perfume. Nuns taught her to fold her hands, not to raise her voice, and to look within yourself, not outward. They placed a candle, laid out a rosary, said, "You are a future saint, child, remember this." But as soon as she left the chapel, everything changed. Ladies-in-waiting taught her something entirely different: how to hold a fan, how to laugh so it would be heard but not remembered, how to tilt her head slightly at the words, "Your Highness," so a man would feel he was almost needed, almost, but not completely. They taught her not to be a woman, but to appear one, and not to forget that virginity is a myth if you know how to hide the consequences. Louise lived between these two worlds. In one, the silence of candles, the smell of incense, and the trembling voice of the abbess. In the other, whispers, rouge, the rustle of silk, and a gaze that lingered on the neck slightly longer than proper. She understood early that her body wasn't hers. It was a court stage. It belonged to attention. It was created to be noticed, and therefore evaluated. When she turned 14, the royal physician during examination said aloud, "The maiden ripens like a peach, early but sweet." After this, the ladies-in-waiting began watching her more closely, and the nuns more gently, as if they had stopped seeing a student in her. Only prey remained. But Louise didn't break. She learned to look into eyes directly, without challenge, but also without fear. She didn't turn away when men froze at her approach. She looked at them like shadows, because she understood, in this world the most dangerous thing is to be not a woman, but a child. A girl has no right to make mistakes. A woman does, especially if she smiles with her eyes. And Louise chose to be a woman, too early, too consciously, as if she took poison, not from despair, but to stop being prey. From then on, she didn't hide her shoulders, didn't blush from compliments, and didn't believe the nuns when they said, "You must remain pure until marriage." She only whispered quietly, "Pure? No. I must remain alive." Chapter 3. A Cell with a Keyhole. Officially, it was the convent of St. Catherine, strict, wealthy, surrounded by silence and stone walls, thick as a man's conscience. The king sent Louise there for salvation, so they said at court. In reality, into exile, packaged as ritual. Formally, it was care for her soul. Unofficially, an attempt to remove temptation from Versailles. Her cell was in the far wing, small window, bench by the wall, cross-shaped shadow on the ceiling from the grating. But most importantly, a door with a keyhole that was impossible not to notice, too large, too conspicuous. Too often did footsteps sound behind it. The nuns received her coldly. They were afraid, not of her words, not of her actions, of her gaze. It didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't repent. It looked like a mirror in which both wrinkles and lust were visible. Louise didn't resist the routine. She prayed, spoke with God, only in her own way. Sitting on the floor, bare to the shoulders, with a burning candle in her hand, sometimes silently, sometimes whispering words that contained neither repentance nor request, only revelation. "You are in heaven, and I am here. Until you come down, my body is mine." The convent breathed routine, psalms, morning services, duties, but in her cell, everything was different. Window always slightly open, curtain slightly moved, dress not fastened on the last button, and by the door traces of footsteps. There were rumors that the convent walls had secret passages, laid out back in the era of duchesses and confessors. Old stones, underground corridor, service staircase by which one could reach the cell without the abbess's knowledge. Rumors, like smoke. No one saw, but everyone smelled it. Sometimes at night, the candle in her room would go out. Then light again. Sometimes at morning service, she would yawn, too lazily, too contentedly. Sometimes rose petals were found in her bed that didn't grow in the convent garden. When the abbess asked, "Do you renounce God?" she answered, "No, I simply don't give him everything. Soul is his, but body is mine. While it can feel, I'm not obliged to be stone." The convent continued to pray, but candles in her cell melted faster, and the keyhole looked at the world with anxious emptiness, as if it knew, God forgives sin, but the body remembers touches. Chapter 4. The first favorite comes barefoot. He appeared as poems come, unexpectedly and without invitation. A young novice, with hands smelling of grapevine, with a voice in which a violin sounded. His name was Etienne, but she immediately called him simply you. He wasn't chosen, he was noticed. One morning, when Louise was walking through the gallery, she saw how he carried a book. Not too carefully, not too quickly. He held it like a person. And in that moment, she understood. He doesn't yet know that one can be afraid. She approached, asked him to hand her the volume of Psalms. He extended the book and held her gaze. Only for a second, but in that second was everything. Prohibition, amazement, and something else. Curiosity. She didn't turn away, only smiled, as royal favorites once smiled in Versailles. He came at night, barefoot, steps silent, only light creaking of floorboards in the corridor. Clothes simple. In his eyes, fear. In his hands, trembling. She was already waiting. The candle burned. The curtain trembled. The air in the cell was thick, like perfume without a name. He stopped at the threshold. I shouldn't be here. She stood, approached, took his palm. You are already here. Everything else, later. He trembled, but not from fear. From not knowing what was expected of him. What should I do? He asked. She smiled. Listen, watch, be. He was clumsy but honest, and from this, unbearably alive. She ran her finger along his cheek, his lips, his neck, not like a woman, like a priestess who finally had an altar worthy of touch. He kissed her hands like a shrine, and she whispered quietly, Do you think I sin? No. I restore justice. I was touched without love for too long. You touch because you want to understand. He looked at her in the darkness and said, You're like an icon, but with a tongue of flame. She laughed, easily, freely, as she hadn't laughed since childhood. At dawn he left, without saying a word, only kissed her shoulder. On the sheet remained his trace, warm, and a scent, like a field after rain. The nun said that Louise looked different the next morning, not absent-minded, not dreamy, but calm. And this frightened them, because a woman who has received choice becomes unpredictable. And she knew this wasn't the first sin. This was the first choice. Chapter 5, A Confession That Was Too Honest. They said of him, came from Lyon, educated, strict, principled. The abbess summoned him as a last hope. Louise, though formerly a novice, didn't fit within the convent walls. Her prayers weren't prayers, but conversation. Her eyes, too open. Her behavior, not condemnable, but inappropriate. The priest was tall, with sharp features, eternally dry voice, and hands that constantly held a cross. He didn't smile, spoke briefly, and immediately appointed her confession. Today, after Vespers, in the chapel, without light. She came, without fear, without a penitent appearance, only with a half-covered gaze and a wrist on which remained a barely visible trace from someone's hand. He sat in shadow, voice restrained, like dust on the altar. "Name your sins, Sister Louise." She sat down, folded her hands, was silent. "Sin begins with silence," he said. She leaned forward, whispered, or perhaps with desire. He tensed, but was silent. She continued, voice even gentle, and too honest. "I don't sin with actions. I sin with thoughts. About body, about skin, about breathing. I don't want to be an angel. I want to be a woman, strong, drunk on closeness, confident. I'm not holier than others. I simply know what I want." He sighed, gripped the cross tighter. "You confess desires? Isn't that the truth? Not what was done, but what I would want to do again." Silence became dense, like fabric. He didn't move, only glanced at her, as if seeing for the first time not a sinner, but a mirror, and understood that in his reflection was the same fire. He stood abruptly, without absolution of sins, without guidance. "We'll talk later," he threw out, and left as if he had stumbled. Later never came. 2 days later, the priest left, without explaining, without saying goodbye. The nuns said he had fallen ill, servants that he was in shock, and the senior sister in the refectory whispered. He prayed all night, but not for her, for himself. Louise sat on the stone bench by the window, quietly, not triumphantly, not victoriously, rather calmly, and spoke aloud. "I don't confess to repent. I confess to remind the world that a woman is not a vessel, but will, including will to the body." Chapter 6. The Woman Who Dreamed of the King. She didn't write letters, didn't send messengers, didn't remind of herself, but she appeared in his dreams. Louis XV, master of luxury, debauchery, and war, lay on velvet pillows, surrounded by pages, favorites, doctors, and books, but woke with the same image in his forehead. Barefoot daughter in a translucent dress, dancing on marble, where every movement was like a challenge. Servants said, "At night the king mutters a name, not aloud, through his teeth, as if afraid someone might hear, or perhaps wants someone to hear." And in the convent, Louise woke simultaneously with him, suddenly, coldly, as if awakened by someone's gaze across distance. She wasn't a novice, she was a memory, and more often whispered to herself, "I was born from a gaze, not from love. I wasn't embraced. I was evaluated." Rumors penetrated beyond the walls. One of the scribes of Versailles, a former courtier, visited the convent, returned, pale, hunched, said only one phrase, "She looks like the king, only without a crown." A week later, Louis ordered the prohibition of speaking her name within the palace walls. Punishment, like a defensive reaction, like a cry into emptiness, "She is dead to us." But the dead don't cause trembling in fingers. At night, a package comes to the convent, simple, without coat of arms, without ribbon, only a box covered in dark leather. Inside, A mirror, heavy, tall, with a frame, carved, gilded, like windows in the hall of mirrors. The mirror, dusty, not washed. In the corner, 2 words scratched with a nail as if in haste, as if there wasn't enough air to say aloud. For you. She looks at it for a long time, doesn't touch, doesn't wipe clean, sits opposite, looks in the reflection, and for the first time in a long while, smiles. Because she understands. He's still looking, which means he's afraid. The nuns don't ask, only whisper among themselves. Who sent it? What's inside? Why is she laughing? At night, the mirror disappears from the cell. Servants didn't see. No witnesses. At dawn in the garden, they find a dress like in childhood, pink, and barefoot traces on the dew. No one finds the woman. But the king, the next day, drops his glass, without reason, and says, "Dreamed again. Saw her in the reflection. Where I wasn't king." Favorites with the scent of incense. She no longer waits, doesn't respond to gestures, doesn't guess by glances. She calls, knows exactly whom, when, why. The first, an officer in retirement, with scars on his wrists and posture as if he's still on parade. They say he was sent to guard the convent from possible rebellion. In reality, he was simply passing by. But her gaze lingered on him, like on a line with an error, and you can't help but reread. The second, a singer from the chapel. Light face, lips like a saint's, voice like wine, thick, enveloping, capable of making even walls weep. When he sings Agnus Dei, tears well up in the nun's eyes. In hers, a smile. They come together. At night, through the back entrance, by the secret corridor where dust is like memory, they are led, not by monks, not by servants, by those who don't ask questions. In the cell, silence. Only a candle burns, incense not yet dispersed. Air, like in a church where the sermon has ended, but sin hasn't yet begun. They enter and are silent, don't bow, don't ask. She sits on the bed, in a white shirt, hair loose, on her wrists bracelets of ribbons. Not ornaments, invitations. "Don't become saints," she whispers, "it's a disease. Better remember that you can feel." They approach. She touches the officer's shoulder, places her palm on the singer's chest. Doesn't choose, doesn't compare, simply connects. That night the convent walls tremble. Candles burn too quickly, and in the garden, they say, a rose blooms, the only one this time of year. In the morning, prayer service. The abbess announces a service for purity and humility. Nuns stand with bowed heads. The singer doesn't sing. The officer doesn't guard. They're not visible, as if they weren't there. But candles by the altar melt faster than usual. Their flame trembles, as if it had seen what cannot be named. Servants clean Louise's bed. Sheet fresh, but in the air, it smells of leather, wine, and incense smoke. And she's silent again, but looks into eyes no longer like a woman, like flame that knows whom it burned and doesn't ask forgiveness. Chapter 8. A letter without seal. It was found by chance. among old papers in the royal chancery, in a drawer that no one had opened for decades. The box was dusty, sealed only with string, without coat of arms, without wax, without signature. Only thick paper and a thin scent of incense, as if the letter had lain too close to prayer or to a body. The secretary was about to throw it away, but the paper was thick, with inclusions of ash. He untied, unfolded, read the first lines, and froze. The letter began without address, without date, without excess. From the very first lines it struck the throat. I sin with body, not soul, but only because the soul didn't allow me to die. They hid me in white, as they hide ash under snow, but ash still smells and warms. I didn't seek forgiveness. I sought right. Right to be alive, right to breathe, right not to be ashamed that my skin thirsted for touches. If this is sin, then I lived it, and didn't hide it behind folds of prayers. The secretary didn't finish reading. He called the senior archivist. He silently took the letter, hid it in his personal drawer with engraving, and whispered, "It's better not to know about this, otherwise we'll have to call this not a letter, but a cry." No name stood, only at the bottom, moved to the side, as if in a whisper. Louise, without title, without de France, without kinship. The next morning they ordered not to include this letter in royal registers. It became a thing outside time. They didn't destroy it. That would have been an admission of guilt. But they hid it, in a folder marked Not to Publish, in the farthest cabinet of the archive, behind scrolls with treasury accounts and forgotten complaints. A century passed. In the hall of old documents, where neither nun nor minister had set foot, a young historian opened a drawer. He was looking for a financial report, found the letter, read it, and blushed, first from surprise, then from shame. And then from admiration. He knew nothing about her, neither year of birth nor biography, only this letter. But he felt he had read not a document, but a living woman who couldn't lie, didn't want to be silent, and didn't allow her body to be a thing. The letter didn't enter his dissertation. The quote wasn't printed. They told him, too personal, too carnal, too bold from memoirs of a convent king's daughter. He didn't argue. But each time rereading, he thought, she didn't die. She wrote herself into words and remained between the lines. Chapter 9. 3 Nuns and 1 Secret. No one announced her death. Simply one day the door of her cell remained closed too long. First the servant knocked, then knocked again. There was no third time. Inside, empty. Candle extinguished, sheet smooth. On the table a sheet of paper without text. On it a drop of wax, as if someone had still tried to light but changed their mind. They didn't find the body. There were no traces. Only on the windowsill, 3 pink petals. Such didn't grow in the garden. A week later, 3 nuns leave the convent, each in her own way. The first leaves quietly, under cover of darkness. Later she's seen in the village, where she rents a room from an old widow. A month later, it becomes clear she's pregnant, lives alone, doesn't say from whom the child is, but every night, before sleep, strokes her belly and whispers, You will be one who isn't afraid to look. The second remains in the convent 2 more years, doesn't talk to anyone, never participates in services. They say she saw what can't be explained, or understood. She dies silently, without words. Only on her chest they find a small locket, inside which a tiny paper with the word, I was. The third goes to Lyon, rents a room under a false name. A year later, a book appears, without author, without title, only the cover, dark, like night in Versailles. Inside, the story of a woman given to a convent but preserving within herself the fire of desire. A story about a cell where candles burned and men who came barefoot. A story about letters that can't be quoted aloud. The book is banned within a week. Authors are sought, not found. But a copy is preserved in the library of an old professor. He tells students, this isn't a novel. This is confession without request for forgiveness. In all these stories, one woman. But in each, she's called differently. Marguerite, Jeanne, Louise. The one who sinned, the one who wrote, the one who disappeared. On the stone that lies in the garden by the convent, many white walls cracked, floors creaked, vaults muffled the sound of steps as if the walls themselves no longer wanted to listen. Generations of abbesses changed, nuns forgot the names of predecessors, but her name they didn't pronounce and didn't forget. She remained not in books, in cracks, in darkness. In pauses between psalms, when a candle would suddenly begin to tremble, they said draft or creaking wood. But the candle would go out, and one of the sisters would turn too sharply. In the garden by the south wall stood a marble plaque, without cross, without name, only an inscription carved shallowly, as if the hand trembled. She belonged to God, but He didn't manage to come for her first. No one admitted who placed it. At first they wanted to remove it, then got used to it, and then were afraid to touch it. In the chapel, candles disappeared, didn't go out, disappeared completely, with stands, with traces, as if someone took them. Didn't steal, but collected like memory. Once in the library, a student preparing a manuscript heard laughter, not loud, not mocking, light, like from play, as if someone remembered something awkwardly pleasant. She turned, no one. But on the edge of the shelf lay a petal, pink, like in that garden where such roses never grew. Another time, one of the nuns saw traces in the chapel, barefoot, small, leading directly to the altar, there where the carpet used to be, where, according to rumors, she danced. For that's exactly how she always saved herself, with dance. Even when she prayed, even when blood flowed, even when the soul was asked to fold into a case and lock with a key. She moved, as if thereby reminding she's not an icon. She's living movement between blessing and sin. The nuns now don't speak of her, but each one knows, each one who has awakened at least once in a cell with hot cheeks and an unclear dream. Each one who felt on her skin a gaze that couldn't be. Each one who knew in this convent there was once a woman who didn't choose between body and soul, but learned to breathe with both.